So I'm here to talk about entrepreneurship. But before I talk about entrepreneurship, I want to tell you a story. Call it a fable. Do you know what a fable is? Does anybody know what a fable is? Tom knows the answer, but he's keeping quiet. Yeah, here. Sudhanshu. Right, right. It's a story which is told for a purpose, to communicate some kind of learning. And I think it's a great way to imbibe or to communicate learnings. And so this is a fable. It's entirely invented. And like all fables, it's very simplistic. So don't look at it and say, but how can this happen? Just bear with me for a while. So this is a fable about a desert island. Okay, so it's an island somewhere in the middle of, let's say, the South Pacific. And we don't know how the people got there in the first place, but there's this small community of people living over there. And they've never known anybody from any other place in the world, just their island. And to make things very simple, for the sake of this fable, there are only two products which they consume. What would those two products be? Water, yeah, that's a good one. Yes, they consume water. That's not part of my fable. Yeah, they consume water, they consume air, they consume love. But from this point of view, there are two products on which they subsist. One is fish from the lagoon outside their island, and the other is coconuts from the trees, right? So between that, they've got water with some amount of salts in it, electrolytes from the coconut water. They've got protein, they've got fat. They're reasonably healthy. And for the sake of this fable, let's assume that on average, each of them is able to, by the toil of their bodies, pull down 4 coconuts a day from the trees. And they're able to get 2 or 3 big fat fish from the lagoon. And on average, it's more than enough for each of them to be healthy. Also to accommodate the odd child who comes in, or the odd old guy like me who doesn't have the energy to go out and fish. But you know, the system kind of functions. And nobody questions it, because this is all that they've known. There's this one young guy. Let's call him Chris. Which is not to say that Chris is young, but anyway. So there's this one young guy called Chris, and he says, you know, it's okay, this is cool, but all I do is I wake up in the morning, go and wash my face in the lagoon, and then I'm looking for a tree, trying to figure out whether I can clamber up this tree, can I reach the ripe coconut maybe at the end of it. And by the time I finish that, it's time to go fishing, and this is all I do every day. Surely there's got to be some better way. This thought keeps going around in his head for weeks and months and years. And one day in the lagoon, he sees a washed up stick. And that gives him this idea. You know, maybe I can use this stick to bring the coconuts down from the tree. And he tries, and the stick is sort of poking things, but he's not able to bring it down. And he starts thinking about what he can do. And then the whole day goes by, and he hasn't had his fill of coconuts. So now he's really hungry. He abandons this, and for several weeks he goes back into that pattern of getting 4 coconuts, fishing. But this thought hasn't left him. His mind is restless. He's a maverick. And he says, you know, this is going to take me several days to perfect this technology of how to bring a coconut down from the tree without climbing. And so this guy works extra hard for 3 or 4 weeks. And he restricts his consumption of coconuts to 2 or 3. And after a couple of weeks, he has this little pile of coconuts on the side. And now he says, now I can spend 2 weeks on getting this technology right. Cut the story short, he actually is able to get this tool together, which is one long stick, another short stick at the end, which is like a hook, and start pulling down coconuts. It's like a miracle. In 1 hour, he's able to pull down 20 coconuts. Now, I'm going to stop here for a minute. What has happened so far in this story? From an economic lens, what has happened? Sorry? Innovation. What went before the innovation? Sorry? Speak a little louder, I can't hear you. A need, yeah. Very good. Anything else? As a result of the innovation, the productivity increased. But everybody's missing one thing. He made a trade-off. What was that trade-off? Right. He saved. Right? He saved, and that saving allowed him to innovate. Right. Okay. Let's continue. So now this guy is able to accumulate this pile of coconuts, and if he spent half of every day in accumulating coconuts, now he only needs to spend 10 minutes a day to accumulate the coconuts. Now, where do you think the story goes from here? What happens after that? There are many possible stories, so let's explore it. Where can this go? What happens on the island?
He has more coconuts than he needs.
That's true. What happens to the rest of the island? Sorry, they become very jealous. Yes, they do. They do. So one of them, Tom, comes along and says, "Where did you get all these coconuts from?" And Chris is a smart guy. He picks these coconuts only in the early hours of the morning, and then through the day he covers this tool up with sand so that he's able to protect his trade secret. Now, what do you think happens?
He says, "Hey, I'll sell you the coconuts. You guys can have leisure, but maybe you do something."
But he can sell them the coconuts, but what are they going to trade the coconuts for? None of them have a surplus. That's where we started from.
But if they're not doing coconuts, they can spend all their time.
Right. But they still have the problem of where do they start? Where do they get the savings from to trade for coconuts?
They have to work for that.
Credit. Right. One day we'll get there. But at this point in time, there's no credit in the system. No, these are great answers. These are great answers because they point to the fact that societies evolve. But at this point in time, there's no credit. They have to work for it. So there are many for him. So there are many possible answers. And let's say that he continues to be really, really smart. And he says, "You know what? I actually hate fishing. I hate going into that salty water and, my legs itching and so on and so forth." So he puts them to work. He says, "You spend the whole day fishing, and thereby you save all the time required to get the coconuts, and I will give you the coconuts." After a while, unfortunately, there are too many fish for Chris to eat. And Chris likes to be lean and to run in these 5-finger shoes, so he doesn't want any more fish, right? So now we have another problem. Now, where do you think this goes? There are no right or wrong answers. I don't have a script for what happens. You can think of robbery. Great point. Yeah, absolutely. You can have robbery. A marker would be nice. Yeah, okay. So I can think of robbery, but those are negatives. Let's leave them there. We will come back to them. I don't want to rule them out. I think it's really important. Robbery is really important. Saurabh, can you put robbery down and credit? No, I'm robbing your time. You go back and listen. And right. So the point is that now suddenly Chris is sitting on a large surplus, right? He has accumulated a large surplus of both coconuts and up to a point fish, which is bounded by the, please sit down, sir, which is bounded by the number of fish that you can store because the fish are going to go rotten and so on and so on. But he's accumulated a surplus. And now he's also got leisure time. Now, depending on how he decides to share this tool, maybe he's a philanthropist at large, at heart, and he tells everybody how to make this tool. And so now everybody has a lot of leisure time. Is this conceivable? It's conceivable, right? So this is the second important point of this fable, which is that the entrepreneurship, which, as we said, is coming from innovation, and it's coming from a restless mind, and it's coming from the ability to sacrifice, whatever that sacrifice is, monetary, late hours, etc. So there are these three ingredients of this entrepreneur. As a result of his activity, irrespective of how he shares it, whether he gives it away free, charges everybody one coconut or one coconut a day like a royalty or whatever, the fact is that everybody on this island is more prosperous as a result of entrepreneurship. Does anybody think I'm making an exaggerated statement or a statement that's wrong? No. Okay, great. Many governments do, but anyway. Okay. So this is the starting point of prosperity in a society, is entrepreneurship. As a result of this entrepreneurship, everybody on the island, first of all, and probably for a long, long time, Chris, but everybody else, right? And we are saying that in the first place, this leads to leisure for a very large number of people. Now, like all other human appetites, each of us has a different appetite profile. Some people can indulge in leisure all day, 365 days a year, right? People like me. There are other people who get restless with leisure. Who over here is restless by nature? Lots of, okay, Tom is restless by nature. So what would you do with this incredible amount of leisure now, Tom? He would find another thing to do. Now, the number of things that you can do for a moment on this island is quite restricted. They're not very far away from living on subsistence. And let's assume, because as we said, restlessness is one of the characteristics of an entrepreneur, let's assume that Tom becomes the next entrepreneur. And what does he do? He uses that leisure to find a way to make a fishing net. He finds a way that you can weave the palm fronds, the long palm leaves, into some kind of really primitive fishing net. And now the whole story gets repeated, irrespective of how he shares it, whether he gives it away, or he licenses it, or he accumulates a lot of slaves, whatever. The fact is that everybody else on the island ends up becoming better off. And whether that better off translates into having bigger bellies, or having more leisure time, or spending the whole day running around the island in five-finger vibrams like a madman, the fact is that everybody has more leisure. And let's assume primarily that having more, not just material goods, but what is the other thing that's happened? You have more choices. Because now leisure becomes a choice. You don't have other goods, but you have this one more choice, which is leisure.
You could have, let's say, like the headman of the island.
Okay.
Or whatever,
Yeah.
somebody who maybe in like 10 years forgets and then says, hey, it's not fair that Tom gets all this
Okay.
fish.
Yeah, we'll get there. Very good points, because that takes us to government, and we'll get there. Now, everybody has more leisure. What do you think happens now? Tom is another restless guy. Let's say there are no more entrepreneurs on this island. What else could people do with that leisure? There are travelers, yes, there are travelers. Anything else? Very important, yeah. Music, right. Okay, great. So music. So Avinash is a musician. There are no instruments on, but sorry? Coconut is an instrument, right. So we have a percussion instrument, and we have somebody knows how to whistle, and you know how to sing, and suddenly we have a trio. Yeah, the desert island trio. Yeah, right, right. Look how everybody's minds have got energized, right? This is a story of human civilization. When you produce surplus, when you create leisure, everybody's minds get energized. And suddenly we have a trio. And this trio performs at all the weddings. And they can have a 3-day wedding where nobody works. Why? Because there's enough produce on the island to feed everybody. And where did this all start? Started with Chris and then Tom, right? So it started because of these restless guys called entrepreneurs. And as a result of them, not directly, not because either of them was a musician, but they facilitated Avinash's desert island calypso trio, right? And then there's this young lady over there. What's her name? Pavitra. There's this young lady of pure heart who wants to become a traveler. Uh, None of them is a long distance out open water swimmer like me. Okay. And they're scared of the sharks and so on and so forth. So now they need to make this thing called a boat. There have been no boats up till now. There's no need to have a boat, right? Because they were all very self-content. Now, I'm not going to get into the mechanics of it, but now you have all the prerequisites of a boat. Because you've got the trees, somebody's learned how to make some kind of primitive rope with the palm fronds, which you can now also use to lash pieces of wood together, etc., etc. And now you have a boat. And Pavitra and one other young man or young lady decided they're going to go on this boat and go further than anybody in their entire community has been, which up until now is up to the breakwaters of the atoll, which is half a kilometer. And to cut a long story short, and it might not actually be Pavitra and her friend, they might actually drown or whatever it is, but at some point in time, somebody goes to some other desert island. Somebody reaches some other desert island. Now, what do you think happens once you come in contact with another desert island? Well, maybe, maybe not, because they have coconut and fish and they have coconut and fish, but maybe they have a different kind of fish, you know?
Same cycle.
Sorry?
Same cycle. Same cycle as the other island.
Same cycle. Maybe that island, because it has a slightly different kind of soil, also has some vegetables. It has arbi, okay? For example, yam, a kind of tuber, right? So it has a yam, and they know how to cook it. And Pavitra and her friend very reluctantly taste it, and Pavitra says, it's horrible, and her friend says, wow, this is fantastic. And as a gift, they take some of this yam back. And both Chris and Tom, who are the two richest guys on the island, say, this is fantastic. I want some more. And so now this trade starts between the two islands, where now there are several boats, and those boats are going out, and this trade of yam for fish and mackerel for sardines and small coconuts for large coconuts. And at one point in time, there's a wedding on the other island, and these guys say, you know what? Your weddings are really boring. Our weddings are such great fun because we've got this calypso trio. And so now we have an event manager. Okay, one of the things that I do, I'm an event manager. And so I say, okay, I will take these guys across and I'll take them from here to there, and they will perform over there. Right? Now, in this short span of time, maybe 1 year, more likely a few centuries, but the point is that Again, look at the trigger event. The trigger event was this one restless, innovative guy or woman who was willing to sacrifice, partially starve, to create one innovation, led to this whole cycle. Now we can continue this, you know. Now you have 10 islands. And then you have an island where somebody, because he's got all this free time, he's a really good fisherman. Coconuts is not a problem because now you can pull down enough coconuts for your meal in 1 hour. He's got the coconuts, he's got the fish, and he spends his time swimming. He spends his time swimming in the lagoon, and one day he finds this really beautiful, shiny, pearlescent, round object in the corals, which is a pearl, right? So leisure itself has produced products, and not restlessness, just leisure. There's no restlessness here. He just happens upon it. A lot of great discoveries come from leisure, often backed by learning and so on and so forth. You know, I don't know whether to believe the story that gravity was discovered because Newton was snoozing under a tree and an apple dropped on it, but let's assume it's true. So we understood gravity because somebody had leisure. Okay. So you can run the story forward, and we end up with the story of one word. Our current state in the world, our material state, what is it? Compared to then. That was sorry? Abundance. We must have read the same book. Anyway, yeah, we ended up with abundance. It's true. If you compare what we consume and what we have access to, with differences, you know. Georgia, the state of Georgia in the US is much more abundant than the state of Bihar in India. I'm referring to Chris's state and Kumar's state by a factor of about 70. Nevertheless, compared to even 500 years ago, we live in a state of abundance. And from my reading of the way in which the world and society has evolved, this is down to one simple factor, which is the restless, innovative entrepreneur, and to some extent, the restless traveler and trader. Because the first traders had to be travelers, with the exception perhaps of kings, you know, that's a special category and so on and so forth. But basically, you had to travel if you had to trade. So we can say that the story of the progress of human civilization is the story of entrepreneurship. And yet, if you read anything about government policy, or if you read about the curriculum for any of these seminars that has been held in the last 20 years, it was Kumar who said, we've never had a talk on entrepreneurship. That's pretty weird in my way of looking at it. We look at everything else except the first spark of the economy, of the modern economy. And it's not just the first spark, which sort of disappeared, you know, like the first spark of cosmic creation or whatever. It's a spark that continues to ignite economies. And I can bet you that 90% of what you consume in a day has been improved, if not invented, but has been improved by entrepreneurship in the last 15 or 20 years. You know? So some products of entrepreneurship are radical, like the cell phone. You know? Some of them are marginal, and we take them for granted. But they're real. I'll give you one example, my favorite example, which is, as Kumar mentioned, I'm a trekker. And I remember very well the first time I went on a long trek in an area where there was no habitation, high up in the mountains. My entire backpack was full of warm clothes. It was all wool. Now, wool is a horrible material for the mountains. Because if it rains and the wool gets wet, it loses its insulation property. Aside from the fact that it just literally filled my entire backpack. You know, woolen gloves, woolen hat, 2 woolen jerseys, and this really, really stuffy sleeping bag. Today, we all take these quick dry clothes for granted. We take fleece for granted. As I get older and every kilo on my back matters, I know that I'm saving at least 3 or 4 kilos due to these entrepreneurs who've said, yeah, wool is nice, but can we come up with something better? So I think there's this delicious sort of irony in taking entrepreneurship for granted, not including it in curricula, not talking about it in economic policy, and we all focus entirely on what? What is most talk of economics about?
Stopping them.
About the government, about what the government should do, what the central bank to do, what policy should be, etc., etc., etc. And a lot of it is dedicated to stopping them. Absolutely right. But now let's turn back on ourselves. Let's turn contrarian to our own thesis and ask, in this cluster of desert islands that we've sort of imagined over the last 20 minutes or so, what could be the role of government? Is there a need for government? And if so, what roles could government have performed? Those are both excellent points. So this is, yes, you need some kind of protection against robbery. And the question you've raised is about private armies. Just to use a very good point. Yeah. So perhaps you need government to prevent against robbery. Yeah.
Something like innovation grants, so for people from disadvantaged communities who'd like to explore this area.
Wow. Okay. We've jumped straight into the middle of the 21st century, right? We'll come back there. Yeah.
So a government can give credit to people to set up plants so that they can extract coconut, they can make coconut and coconut products from them. They can sell further.
Do we need governments for credit? No.
No, not exactly for credit, but like she said, disadvantage to provide them.
Okay, let's stay away from that just for a little bit. We are still in a very primitive stage of development. We're not yet in the era of wokeism. Okay? Yeah.
So I'll take protection further. So
Yeah.
when you were an isolated island, you
Yeah.
needed protection only from your people.
Right.
Like within the.
Yeah.
Now that you have boats, you can travel. You need protection from what if other islands.
Right. Right. So this is internal protection, and this is defense. Okay.
Maybe the government sees that some people are getting old, and so it says, hey, all of you young people, give me one coconut, and then so that we can distribute it.
Okay, so whenever we talk about government, I would suggest that we also ask a question, which is this something that absolutely requires government intervention, or can it be done by substituting community for government? Or can we go further and substitute family for community?
But what is the difference between community and government?
Ah, great question. Anybody? What's the difference between community and government? Coercion. Brilliant. Wow, absolutely brilliant. These two guys have picked up the exact words that I would have used. Abundance and coercion. So he's saying that governments, the primary tool of governments is coercion. Okay, we'll come back to this because I'm sure there are many people who disagree. I agree completely. Okay. Right. But to go back to her point, which is providing for the old. So I stay with my question, do we need governments for that? No. In certain very, very, very specialized circumstances, perhaps you need them, okay? But this has primarily been the role of families. And in the absence of families, communities. And then we are getting into a very complex question if we sort of fast forward to the 21st century, which is, does an overweening government also accelerate the breakdown of communities? Because instead of these horizontal relationships between each of us, all the relationships start getting transferred into vertical relationships. Yeah. So that's a question. But by and large, most functions that can be done by a family or a community, in my view, should remain there. In the absence of it, what happens? Again, my view. The moment you turn to government to solve problems which can be solved over here, you strengthen government. And when you strengthen government, you start creating all other kinds of problems, and we'll go there. Yeah, something is troubling you.
I mean, so you wrote the term private armies there. So can you also apply those to defense? I mean, why do you even need government for the defense if the island is so small? I mean, we are not talking about a very big country here.
Yeah. So, can somebody tell me what is the difference between this and this? Yeah.
Private army is for, let's say, for the example or the person we gave earlier, that I am hiring some people to protect my coconut.
Correct. Yeah.
But this
And
is
the
a
army.
collective sort of
Correct.
defense
Correct.
against
Correct. So,
for an enemy.
this, a private army, if I or Chris, as the guy who has this entire go down full of coconuts, I need a private army to protect my own goods, and therefore I will pay for it. But defense, you could argue, to protect you against a marauding flotilla of boats from some other island is something which will benefit the entire community. So the welfare from the protection of coconuts is for a private individual. The welfare from defense, from outside, is for the protection of the.
Why can't this be community run as well? Why?
Yeah, I mean, that's
Great question. Great question. And at essence, there's no difference. At essence, there's no difference, which is that there is a need which all of the community has, and therefore the community finds a way to fund it. And in order to fund it, they need to raise resources. And you can call those resources taxes or levies or tolls or whatever it is. That's the essence of governance, right? Fulfilling a pan community need. Now, if that army was also used to protect Chris's coconuts, I would say that's a misuse of governance. Okay, it does happen, but I would say it's a misuse of governance.
Yeah, I was actually coming to that in terms of governance and coordinate private armies. What if Chris decides that I'm the king now of this place?
Right, great question. Absolutely great question. Which is then, when you accumulate too much power in the hands of an individual, then you run the risk of that power being misused. Absolutely right. Which is why people like us, who represent the faculty in this weekend effort and who've designed this, believe in limited government. Because when you have large governments, the misuse of power is more than likely to happen. And that's why you want to restrict the functions of government. So we have so far found one use for government, which is, or community, we are not choosing between the two as of yet, which is of defending the island against outside forces. Yeah.
But what if I were to say, oh, but you said you're not distinguishing, but I just wanted, so since you distinguished as coercion, what if I say, I don't really believe this
Right. Yeah. 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 So that's a problem. There's no easy. I mean, there's lots of economic theories about this kind of thing, and that's why you end up with some amount of coercion, because otherwise you have the free rider problem, right? And in this particular case, I would think that the benefits to society of everybody contributing to, yeah, Akash, one sec, to this army uh, are significant enough to pressurize the free rider. You know, I don't think free riders are a great idea, but as long as the need that is fulfilled by that community stroke government function are truly pan community, then I think some amount of universal cess or collection or tax or whatever is required. Yeah, Akash?
Yeah, I think the point about coercion, right? It would not be coercion in case there is a free, there is free entry and free exit. So, for example, if I've signed the charter on day one when I'm joining, and I
Yeah.
say that, hey, when I'm signing this charter, I am agreeing
Yeah,
that if I live here,
right.
I would give my 2 coconuts for
Great point.
price.
Great point. You know, and within the context of our little fable, which of course was highly simplistic, but now we're getting into a little bit more into the real world, your response could be that, you know, the toll over here is 4 coconuts a month, and the toll in an island called Dubai is only 1 toll a month, and so I'm going to Dubai. And that's absolutely fine, you know, and that's what we see today. And I think it's a great situation that jurisdictions start competing for low taxes. This is the only way. There are only two ways for taxes to go down. One we saw in Sweden, where taxes reached a situation where the tax to GDP ratio of Sweden reached 60% or some ridiculous figure like that, and the economy collapsed and they had to bring it down. But the other, I think, even more potent force is tax competition. You know, Dubai, Cayman Islands, Channel Islands, etc., etc. Absolutely, absolutely. But for the large part, emigration and large movements of population is a relatively small. I mean, it's large in absolute numbers, but in terms of percentage of people on the world, it's a relatively small force. But
That's also got to do with capital controls, which in this example is not there.
so yeah, Akash is determined to drag us right into 2024 and capital controls. We don't even have capital as yet, right? So in order to have capital, what do we need to have? Okay, I'm going to wind back a little bit, right? We sort of, like I said, I don't have a script. And if I had a script, I by now would have reached the role of money, right? Up until now, we have not discussed money, okay? In the beginning of this little fable, everybody was producing enough for their own consumption, right? There was no trade. In the second stage, there was very little trade. You know, there was very little surplus, there was very little trade. But we gradually moved to a situation where there was some amount of trade. There was trade not just of goods, but also of labor. And then we started trading with another island. And by the time we reached 20 islands, the number of goods and services, not to forget our Calypso trio, was quite diverse. And now barter starts becoming a problem. Okay? It's very easy to say, I have 2 extra coconuts and you have 2 extra fish. 1 fish equals to 1 coconut and you trade. But then these guys say that their charge is 20 coconuts, the Calypso trio. And then this Pearl comes along and he says this is worth a hell of a lot of money. But he doesn't know what to do with 500 coconuts. So now, as you know, when you're trading 1:1, you have 1 price. When you're trading 2:1, now you need 3 different prices. And when you're trading, the number of prices that need to be fixed start going up exponentially. And so no system can create those. And so what do you come up with? You come up with money. Now, for the time being, let's not get too much into the characteristic of money and what it needs to have and so on and so forth. So you end up with money. Now, what is that? What is money doing? Today, we understand money in many, many different ways. One which we've talked about up until now was, we've been talking about credit. But what, in this little example that we just had, what is the primary role of money? A unit of exchange, a unit and a medium of exchange. So rather than trying to have a price for coconut versus fish, a price for coconut versus Calypso band, a price for coconut versus a ride to Dubai, etc., etc. And then you need the same prices for fish versus these, etc., etc. You say, let's price everything in terms of, let's say, cowries, little shells, because that's been a unit of exchange for a long time. And so you simplify all the calculus required for trade. Everything is traded against that cowrie. That becomes the unit of measurement. But what is credit? In this island, and now we're willing to start walking from the 2nd century BC, we're willing to walk into the 3rd millennium. What is the role of credit? Where does that come from?
I mean, let us say that I want to go and explore further more islands.
Yeah.
And I need to build a lot of boats for it. I need a lot of money for those boats.
Right.
But I do not have that amount of money. But since Tom and Chris, they are successful entrepreneurs. So I can just ask them, okay, you give me money now and I will return you more money later. So they can credit me that money.
Absolutely right. Absolutely right. So, where is credit coming from? Credit is coming from a huge surplus which is accumulated by somebody which they do not require now. So, you first need surpluses in order for, because if I'm a guy who's just getting 4 coconuts and 2 fish a day, I can't give you credit. I can say I'll give you credit, but my credit means nothing, right? So, credit needs to be backed by surplus. Otherwise, it's meaningless. Right? So, first that surplus had to be generated. That surplus needs to be in a form which can be stored. And there is a limit to which you can store that in terms of physical goods. Because the coconuts can go rancid and the fish can get incredibly smelly, right? So nobody wants smelly credit or fishy credit. Maybe that's where the word fishy came from, right? Nobody wants fishy credit. So you want something which is not going to deteriorate. And you want something which is not going to take up vast storehouses. So let's just assume that the first credit was the pearls rather than the cowries, because those are really, really small, those are valuable, everybody likes them. And so Chris, being a smart guy, has converted all of his surplus into pearls. And because pearls are rare throughout this entire archipelago of islands, the pearl has become the unit of exchange across all of these islands. Right? And that becomes the source of credit. And that becomes money. Because everybody accepts it, and there's more or less an agreed price. That, 1 pearl of this size is equal to 100 fish, 1,000 coconuts, whatever it is. Maybe there's an exceptional pearl, which is twice the size, and So without getting into all of that complexity, so now you start having surplus which has been created into wealth which can be stored, not just wealth which can deteriorate, and wealth which can be easily traded. If the wealth is going to consist of enormous boats carrying coconuts from one island to another, they're not going to fund an expedition to Dubai. I mean, it can, but let's keep it simple, it can't. And it requires, again, going back to where we started from, it requires Chris and Tom to say we are not going to squander all our wealth by having a party every day with, this Calypso band. Or maybe this band is really so bad that by the 3rd time they don't want to hear it again, or whatever. So they've started accumulating these pearls and funding these voyages. Now, very interestingly, not all of these voyages were funded by giving infinite credit to the explorer. What's the other form that these voyages took? No. Sorry? Exactly right. Exactly right. They said, we will fund your trip to this place where there is silk and there are peacock feathers and there are wondrous spices. And if you bring them back, you get 1/3 and we get 2/3. Right? Exactly the same thing. And if the ship was drowned, if it was wrecked, or if it was besieged by buccaneers, the venture capitalist lost his money and the entrepreneur lost his life.
It's a pretty bad valuation for the risk involved.
Depends on what the options are, right? It depends on what the option. If the option was not a well-paid job as a software developer with Google, then maybe it was a good option, right? Which is why in the US, a lot of startups, after 2 or 3 years, the guys go back to well-paid jobs. Over here, where the well-paid jobs are not so easy, I found that people, it was a real learning for me, people will keep going into startup because the options don't exist. But it's a great point. It's a really great point. Yeah, Tom.
Some people also are adventurers by nature.
Exactly.
And so sailing around the seas at a very high mortality rate, but a lot of people did it because they didn't want to stay at home.
Absolutely right. So the difference of human nature is integral to this story. The starting point was that, the Calypso band was that, Pavitra, who discovered this island which had yams, was that, and as Tom reminds us, despite the odds of drowning under the waves off the Cape of Good Hope, the story of discoverers was the story of people who said, I would rather see the world than sit in this small green island and eat beef for the rest of my life. But the point is that people could explore their inner drives because leisure became available, because material abundance became available. And all of that started, thanks, Kumar, all of that started because there were these guys who went out and created something new. Only underlying the fact that entrepreneurship is so valuable to society, that everything that we take for granted comes from the will of the first entrepreneur to individuate himself. Because otherwise, it's all very easy for each of us to just fall into the trap of the way in which the world is. But it took this person to break out. See, is there some way in which I can break away from this, create a new world? And thereby creating opportunities for other people whose will to be different was not probably as strong, but now you created more room for it. So what we are seeing is more and more and more room being created in society because of these early entrepreneurs. Room not just for material abundance, but also for the abundance of the spirit to embody their own person, to become more and more. Yeah, the flourishing of the soul. What a magnificent phrase. Absolutely right. Yeah. But to go back to that mundane topic of credit, right? So the credit was provided by either a Chris or in later stages by kings and queens. Okay? Now, what is the difference between a Chris and a king? They both accumulated surplus. They both used the surplus partly to live better lives and partly to create opportunities for voyagers, discoverers, etc. What is the essential difference between them? Yeah.
much easier for Chris to go bankrupt than it is for the king.
Okay, yeah.
Depends on how Chris built his wealth versus the king built his wealth.
Okay, so how do you think the king built his wealth?
On the back of violence.
On the back of?
Violence.
Violence, right, right, yeah.
I mean, again, coercion.
Absolutely right, absolutely right, yeah. So the, yeah.
You could opt out of engaging with Chris, but it may be harder to opt out of engaging
Brilliant,
with the king.
absolutely right. The nature of governance and kingship, etc., etc.
Chris thinks of people as his peers.
Not necessarily. He's a snobbish guy. Nobody else is as smart as me, you know. We have lots of those entrepreneurs, right? Elon Musk, for example. Nobody's as smart as me, right? He didn't make his money by coercion. He's a great entrepreneur, but he doesn't think that the rest of you are like him. He thinks that the rest of us are idiots whom he can manipulate on Twitter, right? That's why he bought Twitter, okay? He thinks that if he decides that right-wing violence in the UK is great, then he can convince everybody that right-wing violence is. So you don't have to be a good human being to be an entrepreneur, okay? So let's not confuse the two. But this point is critical, which is that you have the option not to buy something from Chris. Whereas if you are living under a government, your only option to walk out is to actually physically leave that territory, which is not very easy. And in the most oppressive governments in the world, did you have that option to leave? No. Some examples? North Korea. Well, I don't know Turkmenistan, but you're probably right.
East Germany.
Biggest example, East Germany. You tried to climb the wall, what happened? Shot. So you can reach a situation where the power of the state becomes so large that what are you essentially? You're a prison. What is the other place where they shoot you when you try to leave? Prison or Hotel California. Yeah?
One thing, I think, see, if someone's going to complain that somebody gave me a stale fish or a cooker which is too old, I think there is a role of the king in a sort of negotiation, dispute resolution, and
He's shaking his head. Why are you shaking your head? Please, 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 please.
Yeah, because it's in the best interest of both the parties to make sure that the contract is held.
Right.
For
Right.
them to sort of continue being in this.
Yeah. So you know sorry, you had something to say.
So I just wanted to ask, because if they're purchasing in Chris, they have the option of not engaging. But then what about those people who do not have the resources to even go to Chris in the first place? Now, my first instinct would be, oh, this is at a government council and the government's going to offer them all those things. But is it still possible for that task to be done by anyone else?
Right.
I.e. the community, and what are the logistics of that? Like, how are we replacing the government over there?
These are all absolutely brilliant questions. Let's stay with this for a minute. And depending on where you are in your own philosophical landscape, you can have a whole variety of answers, okay? The first and the most essential point, I think, is what you said. What's your name? I've forgotten. Yeah. Ronak, yeah. What Ronak said, which is that firstly, it's not in Chris's interest to give you a bad coconut, okay? No,
pay back my credit.
no, but just, yeah, sure. No, I'm not saying it's the only answer. I'm saying this is the first point, which is that a good entrepreneur, when you say good, you have to define good along a time scale as well, right? So somebody who cheats you may make money in the short run, but can never make money in the long run, right? So a lot of good entrepreneurship has to be viewed across a time span. And a good entrepreneur will always make sure that the customer is satisfied. They will go to extraordinary lengths.
Can I
Yeah.
just add very quickly?
Yeah.
That's amazing. A market's reputation mechanism works.
Yeah.
The two exceptions that I just wanted to add to
Yeah.
that. One is that not everybody is rational.
Yeah.
There will be like stupid people who would want to cheat.
Yeah.
Because that's just the
Sure. So we'll come to that. Yeah.
second thing is
Yeah.
that there are also games which are one-off games.
Yeah.
So for example, a guy bringing me tea in a train
Yeah.
has no incentive to, give me like the best tea in the world.
Sure.
Because
Sure. But the second example gets a little more complicated because who's his employer? What is that employer's reputation? How does the railways like to look at it? But fair enough. But I think this is still a very essential point. Now the second point is, what are the supposing that people are short-term. There are short-term entrepreneurs and there will be. There will be cheats, there will be short-term entrepreneurs, people will get short-changed. And my personal view is, yes, we probably need some kind of mechanisms to resolve these disputes. Now, depending where you stand on the philosophical landscape, and it doesn't matter because the idea of this session is only to open up these theories, there are no definitive answers, that you need some kind of mechanism. Now, are those mechanisms to be lodged firmly in the government? Or can there be dispute resolution mechanisms which are private in nature? Now, the classic libertarian view, which is the view to which most people who put this symposium together belong, say that courts, dispute resolution mechanisms, etc., along with defense, belong in the realm of governments. And to a large extent, I would say that perhaps culturally I'm attuned to that thought. And I would say, yeah, this is largely true. But the fact is that today, in many places, especially in India, but not just in India, we are realizing that courts cannot cope. They cannot cope with the loads, they are too tardy, there is no incentive to resolve issues promptly and proactively, and so you now have private arbitration. And today, any large contract will have arbitration written into it. And those arbitration mechanisms are quasi-judicial, judicial, onshore, offshore. If I sign a contract today with any foreign party, it is not subject to the laws of either India or that jurisdiction. It's going to be sorted out in the International Arbitration Courts in Singapore, which has become now the favored place because British law, etc., etc. But for the sake of this discussion, let's say that broadly people agree that external defense and courts belong to our roles primarily of the government. 10 or 15 years ago, I would say they're squarely roles of the government. But now, seeing the way governments are not very good at fulfilling their roles, I would say maybe that's not such a great idea. So, very interestingly, we've gone from entrepreneurship to the role of government. Okay, but I injected that, and there's a very good reason for it. It didn't happen artificially. So let's just complete this thought and talk about. Let's talk for the next 15 or 20 minutes about two things. One is, what are the other functions that government need to support? And then we will move to another topic, which is, how is it that governments make life difficult for the entrepreneur? Okay. So let's just complete this, and let's go back to credit and the role of government in credit. Yeah.
So, in the simplistic second point we were discussing, as venture capitalists start putting money, and then there are other entrepreneurs who come to realize that there are people venturing, going in the water, and they're drowning, etc. There could be a role of entrepreneurship in bringing about insurance.
Right.
And the government may, could say that the government could play a role in it, but it's not really required.
It's not required, and most insurance is private. So there have been no major, except in socialist countries like India, where you had only government insurance and private insurance has only opened up over the last 30 years. So insurance is not a big issue because nobody is claiming, except some kooky countries are claiming that insurance needs to be done by the government. So let's leave insurance out of it, yeah.
Another problem the community needs to solve, not necessarily by the government, is if Chris becomes now too powerful and I have a way to make a tool,
Yeah.
I may kill him to,
Yeah, so that's like more, from robbery to more generalized violence. And it's...
But private protection, sorry, just to
Yeah.
that point, they may ex ante protect, but you may also want to build a way to ex post punish people. Or
Absolutely right. Absolutely right. So you need to have some kind of punitive measures which can be, and therefore you go back to courts. So courts not just for contract protection, but courts also to enforce punitive measures against the individual, right? So we go back to courts, and we believe that if these courts are governed by the community stroke government, there will be less bias than if they're run by a private individual. And I think there's reasonably good chance to at least believe that, even if it's not always true, because you have power structures, etc., etc. So let's park that there. Yeah.
The coastline is basically limited,
Yeah.
let's say, even if it's an island, let's
Yeah,
just
yeah, yeah.
assume for this example. And all this trade is happening
Yeah.
because they're taking ships from this island to another island. So there is a dock and there's an infrastructure there. And that, for to make it easier for everybody to trade, and if it's not owned by a private party, that shipping infrastructure or that dock, there is a reasonable argument that maybe government.
So, firstly, in practice, what we've seen is that, so we're starting from the premise. The starting point of this premise is that there are innovative, enterprising people in the world. If you say that the government sees this need before a private individual sees it, I say it must be pretty enlightened government. And most governments in the world, if you were to use an adjective to describe them, would enlightened be the first adjective that came to your mind? Not, right? And this is why, again, same thing, which is that most ports are private. Look, the reason that this talk was entitled Find the Gap, and I was actually hoping to end this talk with that, is the essential difference between an entrepreneur and a MyBop government. MyBop means mother, father for the two non-Hindi speaking people over here, is governments say, mind the gap. As they say in the metro when you get off the metro, right? Mind the gap. So they are your MyBop, they are your nannies, because without them, you poor people will not survive in this big, bad, cruel world. And do they do that because they really care for you? Or do they do that as the first gang lords did? What did they say? They said the same thing. We will protect you. But for that, we want protection money. Okay? I'm being a little extra cynical here, but I believe that there's more than a little bit of truth to this. Okay? So governments say, mind the gap. And what does an entrepreneur do? He finds the gap. He says, here is this gap of an unfulfilled need. And that's how you define entrepreneurship, is that he creates a product to meet a need which has not yet been fulfilled. As I said, that could be, just a second, that could be a completely radical product which nobody has dreamt of before, or in a world of increasing sophistication, it can just be a tiny improvement. But that is the essence of entrepreneurship, is to find the gap and to fill it. Yeah.
Is this an emergent phenomena of something called the government, or is like people at the top things like this, or is this like this happening?
Wow, I don't have an answer to you because I'm not a political philosopher at all. But I would say that there are two streams which fuel this. One is that there is some need for some amount of community, some community force, which is not a great word, but some amount of community spirit to do some of these things. Courts, defense, internal police, etc., etc. But one branch of what this body of economists and political economists study is something called public choice, where what it says is that just as each of us is governed by incentives, you need some kind of anticipated reward to do something, so are governments. Because governments are like human beings. They're also responding to incentives. They're not these all powerful, all beneficent gods sitting above us, right? They are kings, they are emperors, they are people of infinite power, they are cruel, they are extractive, all of those. Sometimes they can be the opposite. Now, if you have power, a major drive for you is to acquire more power. And to do that, you will do anything. You will convince people that they are not capable, that they cannot teach their children, that they cannot come up with measures for community welfare, that they don't know how to look after their old, that they should not be taking choices of what drugs they consume, on and on and on and on and on. And therefore, as I said earlier, the desire of governments to grow larger and larger is the story of human history. You take a country which believes in free enterprise, which embodies free enterprise to most people in the world, which is the government from which these two gentlemen, the country from which these two gentlemen come, which is the US of A. If my memory serves me right, Tom and Chris, please correct me. Roughly a century ago, before the First World War, the tax to GDP ratio in the US was 3%. It's now 20%. Is that right?
More.
Broadly, right? This is a country which believes in free enterprise. Are you saying that every dollar of the trillions of dollars that the US government has accumulated over the last 120 years has been for the good of society? I don't have to be a cynic to say absolutely not. Now, the point is that I am not saying that every rupee that Chris or Tom have spent has been well spent. I'm not saying that. This is not a moral statement, because it is not for me to decide how you spend your money. But the point is that it is money that they acquired in free trade. Whereas the money that governments acquire is by coercion. See, point is very simple. I don't want to pay taxes. If I were to calculate that, I, unfortunately, as a reasonably well-off person, I pay something like 35 to 40% of my income in taxes, whether you take, combine direct and indirect taxes. I don't think that more than 1 in 3 rupees spent by the government is well spent. But I don't have a choice except to shift jurisdictions, which is also very, very complicated. So I think that's the issue. And that's why the story of economic history and the relationship with the human being and the state for the last century at least has been that governments will expand. Governments will extend their role into your life to cover more and more things because the incentives are so. You give a person power, they will want more power. And the only way to restrict it is to push back. If you don't, it will keep creeping. Legislation will keep creeping and take over more and more aspects of your life, and the only way to fight that is to fight back, otherwise it will continue. So that's the story, right? Okay, we have very little time left. So I would like some of you to come up with examples of what you see or threats you see of how this entrepreneurial spirit is encumbered by society stroke governments and what we can do about it. Yeah.
I mean, so I am working with an organization which is working for the government. So
Okay.
they're building some like app for digitalization of MSME. And what we've seen is that most of their time is not going into actually developing the product, but to see that, okay, that particular bureaucrat does not get angry. Okay, I need to give this bureaucrat a discharge watch so that I get my payment released on time. And what happened was that we delivered like 3 milestones already, and we just got the check for the first milestone.
Right. Okay.
And
Okay.
we also gave.
So this is just inefficiency and the lack of incentives which are aligned with your true role. Just to echo what you said, I was on a train one day about 4 months ago, and sitting next to me was a lady who was a middle-level executive in the Food Corporation of India. And it was very irritating because she was on the phone non-stop. It was 6 in the morning. I wanted to snooze. She was on the phone non-stop. But what was really interesting, by 7 o'clock, she was on the phone, and we got off the train at 11 o'clock. She must have spoken for 3 hours. And she was speaking only to colleagues. Okay, so it wasn't like she was calling home to check whether Papu had had his breakfast. Okay, but every single conversation was about who had been promoted, who was in the good books of the boss, who was in the bad book, how she needs to come. Not one thing was about food. I did not hear the word grain or food once in those 3 hours. It was hilarious. And that can only happen in a bureaucracy. Okay.
I think IPR also, I mean, if I want to uh, create something.
Great point. Great point. And to some extent, I anticipated it. Because what did Chris do in the first stages? He buried his stick under a pile of sand. That was his way of protecting his IPR. But in a modern world, you would say it needs to be protected by patents. And that kind of patents falls under the broad ambit of justice, legal systems, etc., etc. And that's why possibly you need government in order to do this.
No, I meant that the way government, I'm sure intellectual property does need protection, but I'm saying that the way the government regulates it is itself very problematic.
Sure, sure, sure. So if you're saying that governments do not fulfill their functions well, you got an automatic buy-in from me. I'll write you a check for every time you say that. But the point is that this is one of those areas where we are yet to find some other mechanism which beats that of governance. Because to enforce it, you need some kind of punitive measures. And we have agreed, I just want to say this, that, no, the Calypso band is a really bad band. So, it also distracted me. Yeah, I wanted to say that the essence of government, as somebody said over today, what we've agreed as a society, most modern societies, is moving from these private gangs to a situation where the government has a monopoly over violence. The fundamental contract of a modern nation state is that the only person who is legally allowed to use violence is the state. Okay? Now, I think there's a pretty civilized way to go at it, rather than allowing everybody to legally exercise violence. It's a pretty civilized way to go. But then again, we need to make sure that the government does not misuse that power. And we're seeing a lot of it today. We're seeing encounters in UP especially, which are being celebrated by people. But that means that they're using that monopoly without the check and power of the courts. Because they're saying this is much better than the courts. And why has it happened? Why has it happened? Why does it get popular support? The reason it gets popular support is because the courts are not able to do their job. So issues go to the court, they don't get settled for years and years together, whereas the patent maljustice has been done. And so the cops say, this guy was a criminal, shoot him, irrespective of whether he was a criminal or not. And in the process, they settle a lot of their own scores. So it's a great thing to have, but again, it needs to be backed up by efficient implementation of the concept and the machinery through which it is supposed to operate. But back to entrepreneurs. Yeah.
So there is a role for community as well, because most entrepreneurial ventures, they fail. So the ones that become successful are like a very small number, a small percentage.
Great point.
So those entrepreneurs who fail, they need a backup option or vendors.
This is a brilliant point. This is a brilliant point, and it was very much in my notes for today. And I think the role of society here is twofold. One is that at the stage of growing up, failure is not seen as a failure of the human being. It's a failure in one thing that you do. So you don't make failure a stigma. And again, I see this big divergence between startups I work with in India and the few startups which I funded in the US. People shut the startup down and next day they've opened a new one in the US. Literally. Over here, people will agonize. I'm the guy who's written a check. I'm the guy whose money is going to go down the tube when this guy shuts his business down. But I'm the guy who's telling him for a year before, listen, it's not working. Close it down. You know? So as a society, we're very scared of failure. I'm only using the US as an example because that's the only other country I work with. The US is quite different. Failure is fine, you know. You fail once, you fail twice, it's okay.
Just risk aversion. Like, what if the parents of the boy just said, "Hey, you're not allowed to"?
Exactly. These are manifestations of the same thing. You don't like failure, you don't like risk, etc., etc., etc. Yeah, I'll come to you. So the cultural issues that back entrepreneurship are very important. And those begin for everything, not just for entrepreneurship, as the Nobel laureate Professor Heckman told us at the opening lecture just 3 days ago, in one of the most brilliant lectures I've heard, which is that a lot of what happens in adulthood, a lot of what happens to society comes from the scaffolding that a family gives to the child. And in this sense, you know, I will say that we are changing very rapidly. When I was growing up till the 70s, till the early 80s, business was a bad word. It's very difficult for you to believe. But a businessman meant black marketeer, breaker of laws, somebody who profited out of shortage. It was a stigmatized word. Today it's completely changed, you know, and that's a brilliant thing for society, an absolutely brilliant thing. So these are cultural factors behind entrepreneurship, and that means you have to allow for failure, you have to encourage it, you have to give children the self-confidence to go out and make mistakes. And if it's a family, say, fine, you know, you made a mistake, come back home. The home is still yours. You don't have food to eat. Our table is always there. So that's a very, very deep and brilliant point. I'll just go back to one thing, which is that the reason that business was stigmatized in India in the 60s and 70s was that the government was so restrictive that legitimate avenues of business were closed. And to function, you had to be a criminal. And so there was a good reason for this, you know. So what is smuggling? Smuggling is the government's restriction on trade. Without a government restriction on trade, you can't have a smuggler. But the movies of the 70s, the bad guys sat in a dark place and they had a bottle of VAT 69 whiskey on the table. Now, why VAT 69 whiskey and not Black Knight, which was the Indian whiskey? Because there's nothing criminal in having Black Knight whiskey because it was produced in India by a factory which had a license from the government. VAT 69, very evil, you had to smuggle it in. So this was very simple branding. The bad guys sat in a cellar and drank VAT 69. So look how deep and pervasive culture is. And that culture is informed by the family. It's also informed by society, which is an expression of family, but also very deeply influenced by government policy. And we don't realize how much that infiltrates our personal spaces and the way we look at each other. And if we want a truly enlightened and open society, one that, among other things, creates space for entrepreneurs, then we need to push all those forces that restrict free thought away from the boundaries of where we operate and operate. And I'm just going to close this since I'm in this statement, which is this is even more true for the other space that I operate in, which is non-commercial or non-material entrepreneurship, which is music, literature, and theater. These are even more critical. And that's why the government sees them as really dangerous, because they infiltrate directly into your brain. They affect the way you view the world, they affect the way you view society, not in some roundabout way. Government knows it. They know that these are not just words. They know it. And so theater is censored, and literature festivals are censored, music to a lesser extent. Films are censored. Government back films because they want your thoughts to move in a certain direction. So governments understand the power of influencing your mind. And whether they try and close your mind to entrepreneurship of the material kind, or even more, entrepreneurship of the aesthetic or intellectual kind, they are very, very powerful forces. They can be very nasty forces, and they have to be pushed back. Yeah. Oh, sorry, your question first, Ronak. Yeah.
Sorry, just wanted to check. What's your view on government having a paternalistic view towards businesses in terms of giving them tariff protections, putting up regulatory walls?
Answers? Yeah.
I mean, tariff protection is basically charging me more for a Chinese phone. I would rather.
Absolutely. It's a restriction on free trade. It's not a blanket restriction, but it's putting up the price. Yeah. You know, as someone said the other day, the infant industry argument was used in India when I was your age. You know, we're a young country. You know, we have to protect our infant industries. The grandchildren of those companies are running the businesses, but they're still infant industries. But you have to ask, why is this being done? Is this being done because governments are deluded, or is there more to it? There's always more to it. Protection. When you hear the word protection, think what other word? Racket. Protection is always a racket. And who are the other people who have protection rackets? Mafia. Right. Okay. I think we have time for one or two questions.
One question.
Yeah.
I want to ask you about this discrepancy between the simplicity of these ideas and their failure to be implemented efficiently. So I'm assuming the economic advisor to the Prime Minister, one of this is Sanjeev Sanyal, he probably knows these ideas very well. And
Okay, let me stop you there and let me give you an answer. Okay? Let me give you an answer. No, I'm going to stop you there because it deserves an answer. Okay? So, 3 days ago, 5 of us, 6 of us sitting over here. Huh? Right. Okay, right. He reminds me. Okay. So he reminds me that anything that happened inside that forum is not to be revealed outside the forum. Yeah.
Tell the story.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So, you know, the point is that the government will always say that you need to be protected. That they say, right? They will also say things like, there are lots of people who break trust, and unless we trust people, we cannot give them liberty to function the way they want to. Now, the essential question that arises is, are they saying this because they want to perpetuate power? And they've been told to say this by the people to whom they report? Or are they saying it because they actually believe it? We don't know the answer. We know that it's wrong. We know that countries which protect their industries are countries which create problems for economic growth and prosperity. But the question is, are they doing it because they're being told to do it, or do they really believe it? I don't know the answer. But I think that in one particular case where we heard this discussion, exactly the words that you talked about on the stage, the consensus of people around here was, the guy believes this. He believes that people are idiots. He believes that all of us sitting over here cannot be trusted. And he believes that all the people who are on the street need to be protected from us. I don't know.
I have a
Yeah.
response to that. In addition to what he's saying, I think it goes back to incentives of people who at that position, and often their term is very short, like 5 years max maybe. So they need to pick ideas or policies that can show results quickly as opposed to well thought through good policy pipeline, which probably takes time to show results, right? So these are like low hanging fruits for them, which they can show, oh, we did this, it increased, we brought in so much investment because of this. So I think that's also.
Yeah, I think this is a very important point, and Kumar has indicated that we have to stop over here, which is to say that, you know, to grow, which is to grow mature, mature open societies that encourage entrepreneurship of all kinds. And when you hear the word entrepreneurship, remember one of our early lessons from here, which is that entrepreneurship expands the boundaries for each of us. It didn't only make Chris a rich guy, it allowed him to become a musician and allowed her to become a traveler. Okay? Bad musician, but still a musician, right? And maybe she drowned on her first voyage, but a traveler. So this is what entrepreneurship does. And if any entrepreneur's activities are restricted by society or the government, even in a situation where there are tens of millions of entrepreneurs, it is a little bit of deadening of our souls. Because we agreed, the phrase that she used, entrepreneurship allows the flourishing of the souls.